And we start tonight's show in Cuba, where French President Francois Hollande has had a historic meeting with the island leader Raul Castro. On the one-day trip in Havana, Hollande, with a contingent of French business executives, sought to strengthen economic ties and also called for an end to U.S. trade embargo on Cuba.
Breaking the ice, French President Francois Hollande's visit to Havana this week marked the first time that a French head of state has visited Cuba in over a century. On the top of his agenda, a call for the end of the U.S. trade embargo on Cuba.
I come here at a very important, though uncertain time. France will do all it can to make way for those new decisions, the opening up to be confirmed, and for the measures that were so harmful for Cuba's development to be brought to an end, so that each country is respected for their identity.
But the U.S. economic embargo on Cuba is still in place. Obama has pushed for lifting the sanctions, but he's still waiting for the green light from the Republican-controlled U.S. Congress.
We extend ourselves for relations with the US, but to normalize relations is another matter. That's another matter. The blockade must be eliminated completely.
Cuba will be officially removed from Washington's terror list on May 29, after a 45-day waiting period. But the White House has said the president has no plans to visit Havana in the near future. France, however, is seizing the opportunity, seeking to strengthen ties with the island nation at the time of Cuba's historic détente with the United States.
We want to build exceptional cooperation between France and Cuba to deepen our relations, multiply our cooperation in matters of healthcare, but also to extend exports to other countries.
France, for its part, has long maintained financial interests in Cuba. It is one of the largest holders of Cuban debt. Trade between Paris and Havana totals about $400 million. The two sides signed a deal on Monday to explore for oil in the Gulf of Mexico. Cuba has suddenly become a brighter economic prospect for many countries amid warming U.S.-Cuba relations. But with the U.S. taking its time on the road towards full diplomatic ties, a full re-engagement with the global economy for Havana might take longer than expected.
And for more on the subject, we are joined in Miami, Florida by Mr. Domingo Amchastegui, who is a retired professor of international relations at the Cuban Higher Institute of International Relations. Meanwhile, in Paris, we have Professor Joab Toker from the American Graduate School in Paris. And in Washington, D.C., we also have Mr. Eric Farnsworth from the Council of Americas. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Many people would wonder, why now? Why France? What exactly is likely to be achieved? In that regard, I would like to invite your opinion first, Professor Amchastegui.
All right. It's obvious that this is not something that has suddenly occurred. Secret diplomacy between the United States and Cuba has been going on for years, and more recently for 18 months. So this is the whole culmination of a process that has been going on for quite some time. At the same time, the European Union has been engaged in very serious and very positive negotiations with Cuba that will be completed between June and December of this year, I hope successfully. And President Hollande has given a tremendous positive push to that reconciliation, to that normalization process with the European Union.
All right. Professor Toker, help us to understand politically, what does it mean for President Hollande? Making this one-day trip, yet many regard it as very significant, the first French president ever visit Cuba since Independence Day.
Well, it means when you look from the Élysée Palace, the center of power in Paris, towards the exterior, it means that once again France is playing sort of an, how should we put it, opportunity diplomacy. Because precisely President Obama said whatever he said and did a little bit of what he promised to do in terms of warming up relatively relations between the US and Cuba, then, and because the overall perception of President Obama and America's overall diplomacy in the world is that of a relatively weak one, there's an opportunity, and this is why President Hollande initiates that now rather than, say, a year or 2 years ago. Internally speaking, in terms of French politics themselves, this is something which would strengthen President Hollande's internal position in regard to his own political camp, the gauche, the left, the French left, with which he is in very bad terms indeed, as he is extremely unpopular and enjoys very little support both on the left and both on the right.
I see.
But at least
this is not the very first European leader to visit Cuba during this recent months, or we say when the relationship between Cuba and the West are warming up. We understand the EU leaders were there, and also leaders from Italy were there. Meanwhile, from Asia, for example, Japanese leaders were there. But the thing is, the French president have already claimed himself, and France as well, to be a faithful ally of Cuba, and has vowed to encourage the United States to lift the economic embargo against Cuba. But exactly how much will France be able to achieve that goal? That's still a big question mark. Before we ask some of the panelists for their analysis, let's take a closer look at now what exactly are the economic embargoes against Cuba. Let's see some details.
The commercial, economic and financial embargo was made official in 1962. It's the longest trade embargo in modern history. It bans all exports to Cuba, like agricultural products, Coca-Cola and technology, but allows limited exports of CDs, art and medical supplies. All imports from Cuba, including cigars, nickel, which is one of the island's major earners, and pharmaceutical products, are banned. There's no official ban on travel to Cuba, but Americans face fines if they spend money there or accept gifts from Cubans. And finally, investment in Cuban companies and the provision of credit to Cubans is banned, and there's a freeze on all Cuban assets.
All right. Let me now invite Mr. Farnsworth from Washington, D.C. Help us to understand any of the mentioned economic embargoes. Are they likely to be lifted soon? What exactly is the obstacle that we are seeing right now?
Well, I think this is a question that many in Washington are asking as well. But first, let me say that the terms of the embargo are not nearly as draconian as your correspondent just said. The embargo, in fact, is quite porous. Agriculture products, humanitarian products, medicines are available on the island, and President Obama has lifted those transactions further, and we anticipate that that will continue to be the case on telecommunications equipment and other things, for example. But having said that, the embargo, you're absolutely right, remains U.S. law, and so long as Republicans in both the Senate and the House of Representatives are in control, one has to assume that this is going to be a process that won't happen overnight, although there are many people in Washington who are hoping and working to change it.
Therefore, Professor Toker, I mean, France and the United States, yes, allied countries, but at times they have very different political opinions, for example, about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's just use that example. And therefore, how much persuasive power really does Paris have on Washington when the president claimed that he was going to make quite a bit of effort to make the Americans change their mind, especially the Republicans?
Well, I guess that the diplomatic formula to answer your question is that France has some influence when it comes to Washington, but real politically speaking, not very much so, and especially perhaps over these issues we're talking about, namely regarding Cuba. And I'm saying that also under the control of my colleagues both in Washington and in Miami. I think that things are not going to go very fast on the American side in terms of easing the embargo and the sanctions, because we're towards American electoral year, and we're speaking about Florida, which is one of the two major swing states. So things are complicated, and honestly, I don't see anything coming from Paris with all the goodwill and the entente between Paris and Washington that would be radical in changing either President Obama's or Senate Republican leaders either.
Well, Professor Toker, did I understand what you said right? That is, well, President Hollande said what needs to be said, and yet when it comes to what needs to be achieved, probably still a big question mark. But the thing is, Professor, let me just briefly have you, before we go to the other panelists. We understand on the day of the visit of the French president, Cuban side announced a big oil deal with Total, which is a French oil company. Is that exactly what the President Hollande have in mind, which is, of course, to advance the French economic and trade cause in Cuba before all the other newcomers? Briefly from you.
Well, as far as one can speculate on what was on President Hollande in such an extremely important moment, after all, in his own political career, but it's, nothing new under the sun in that sense. In this respect, I wouldn't expect the analysis of the Cuban trip of President Hollande to be strictly different from any other international summits or bilateral meetings. So yes, oil, as well as tourism, as well as alcohol selling, as well as trade, as well as other aspects of commerce, but that these were not the major issues on his mind and on his planning when it comes to this Havana trip.
Professor Amchastegui, therefore I really need to invite your expert on Cuba. The Cuban leader knows very well, no matter which Western leaders are visiting the country, it is not necessarily going to erase the economic embargo the U.S. has. Even President Obama today, through the White House spokesperson, in a way brush off the possibility of visiting Cuba this year, even though there is so-called a possibility next year. What do you think is exactly going in the minds of the Cuban leaders, given your knowledge of that country? How much do you think they expectly, realistically in fact, know what's going to happen?
I think that the Cuban leadership has said it several times, and they are very, very much aware that this is going to be a long, complicated, with many ups and downs, until we reach a final stage of normalization. The embargo will not be lifted overnight. There are all kinds of signals, statements, you name it, making clear that it will not be overnight. Recently, Undersecretary Selig of Commerce stated very clearly that the whole package, that will take a very long process.
Interesting you use the word long process. Let me get back to you, Mr. Farnsworth. China's relation with the United States warmed up during the 1970s as a result of a strategic needs mutually. One might argue that time also has ripened for that occasion for Cuba and the United States. And yet, how long a period are we looking at? Are we going to see a significant turnaround of attitudes among the Americans, particularly politicians, as they did when China-US relationship happened more than 40 years ago?
Well, I think you are seeing a generational shift among many observers in the United States. The younger generation in particular is looking to have a fresh start with Cuba and with other countries in the region. But you point to a very interesting point about the China-US relationship, and I think you're seeing a strategic shift in Cuba as well, because for many years Cuba has been dependent on Venezuelan oil as the primary driver of its economy, and as Venezuela has economic difficulties and troubles, Cuba is not necessarily going to be able to rely on that economic lifeline well into the future, and so they need economic opening, and they need investment, and they need trade with other partners, and clearly the United States is the first in line for that, but also European countries as well. So there, you are seeing a strategic shift on the island in Cuba. I think from the United States perspective, you're also seeing the people suggest that changing the relationship with Cuba will have broader positive implications for the United States relationship with other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, which have long maintained that the relationship between the United States and Cuba has to be regularized. Having said that, there are many obstacles, as we've talked about, politically, also economically. The economy of Cuba is very troubled. It's only 11 million impoverished people. It's not a modern economy. It has very difficult issues with property rights and rule of law, etc. So it's going to take a lot of time. And I would see this as an incremental process. The one issue that we simply can't know about when it will happen, but it will happen eventually, is when both of the Castros eventually pass from the scene. And then what will the new generation of leadership in Cuba look like, and what will be their interest in maintaining or quickening the process of change with the United States?
Those are certainly very interesting and significant questions. But let me ask you this, Professor Amechastego. Mr. Farnsworth is using Cuba to the U.S. Policymakers as a case study that is likely to demonstrate to the other Latin American countries as to how the U.S. is likely to warm up its relations with another country as long as that country is getting ever closer to the United States. But many would argue, Professor, that this is not maybe the best case study because we're talking about a very long and painstaking process. So in that regard, what should be and can be the attitude of Washington, and how much can politically that be allowed? Meanwhile, how much do you think Cubans can cash in on this opportunity in terms of making its relationship, in a way, speedily faster than what is already being with the United States? Professor.
Yes, I think that the Cuban leadership would like to see developments to gain speed and advances in every possible area, including the lifting of the embargo. They are very much aware of the importance of the United States relationship to Cuba, its economic ties, the many potential, etc. But my own perception is that probably we may be witnessing a very long, complicated process, just like the one China and the United States had between 1954 and 1969 in those 15 years of useless negotiations in Warsaw, where nothing was achieved, until the United States realized that they couldn't go on with their old policies toward China. So at some point, the American leadership will have to come to a final decision, a final conclusion, that all that they have been doing is completely useless. And they have to come up with something really constructive and creative.
Very interesting comparison over there, and certainly a lot of insights from the three of you. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Professor Joab Toker from Paris, Professor Domingo Amechastego from Miami in Florida, and also Mr. Eric Farnsworth from Washington.